So last workshop, we covered this idea of CSS, which was adding styles to your web page. So we used HTML to create information, and then we used CSS to take something that looked pretty ugly and then make it look a lot better. So the website that we left off with was this thing. So this is my web design tips website. Got a little bit of a video, some text, and some buttons to take you to different places. What I want to talk about now is the next fundamental language of the web. And this is JavaScript. And JavaScript is an interesting beast in and of itself. It's another language. It's what we call a programming language. And what it lets you do is do things that HTML and CSS fundamentally can't. It lets you add behaviors that are sort of, your kind of wildest dreams, everything you can imagine that you want to do. And to give you an example of something that I want to do that HTML and CSS doesn't let me, I'd like to talk about a feature that I'd like to add to my website. So when I first designed this website in front of you, I drew some boxes, and now down at the bottom here, I talked about this color generator, and I said I'd explain it to you in a moment when it came time. And now is that time. So what this color generator, this color creator that I want to build is a box at the bottom of my website with a button. And every time I click the button, it generates a new random color and gives me a snippet of code I can put into my CSS that the users of my website can put into their website. So it's like a bit of inspiration. It's just a random color creator, just like those color scheme creators we used before, just on a slightly smaller scale. And there are a lot of moving parts here, and I can't build that with HTML or CSS. And that's what JavaScript allows me to do. It allows me to dream up new behaviors and basically do anything that a computer can do and put it on my website. So last time I demonstrated with HTML and CSS, I demonstrated sort of here's the syntax of HTML, here's the syntax of CSS. You can put all the bits and pieces. They were quite simple to understand. Unfortunately, JavaScript is a little more complicated. And I can't just give you the syntax and say this is all JavaScript is. So if you haven't programmed or coded before, some of this is going to seem a little bit foreign to you. So if you haven't used a programming language before, we do in fact have some introduction to programming workshops that go into a little more depth on this kind of topic. So if this is seeming a little bit fast or a little bit confusing, then by all means go ahead and take a look at that. So there's a link to that in the notes. It's called our introduction to programming, and there are plenty of other tutorials online to get into that. And introduction to programming actually teaches in JavaScript as well. So you'll be compounding those skills. Anyway, to give you a sort of conceptual model for what JavaScript is, it's a list of instructions. I give my website a list of things I want it to do, and then it goes through one by one and executes them. It's as simple as that. So if I were to describe my color generator, my color creator, in terms of instructions, if my website could understand English, I would say, every time the user clicks on this button, I want you to create a new random color and then put it in this box. Unfortunately, my website can't understand English, and I need to describe it in far more strict terms. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and create our first lines of JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our website file, our website folder, sorry. And for those of you who are just joining, you can start off where I'm starting off by going to the notes and opening up our code examples page. And from O2 CSS, that's the finished result of the CSS part of these workshops, you can copy and paste all the code that I've got. Also, if you want to take a look at the finished result, there's O3 JavaScript as well. So starting from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it main.js. So .js stands for JavaScript, and main, like CSS, is just purely by convention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some simple code. I am a web developer. And I'll try and explain this in more detail in a moment, but for the time being, this is what I'm writing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my index.html and then tell my web page to use this script. Now, because we wrote the CSS, you might think that it'd be similar to this. We could use a link, use this rel attribute, maybe it says script. href is main.js instead of CSS. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Just because reasons, JavaScript is not put in the same way as CSS. people don't like consistency. What I'm going to do instead is put it at the end of the body tag, which does make a whole lot of sense. We're saying that the body tag is for things the user can see. The script isn't really something a user can see, but this is what we're doing. So I'm going to use a script tag, and I'm going to use this type attribute instead of the rel attribute. I'm going to set it to text/JavaScript. Again, this is just another way of saying these things, and it's not intuitive, but we're just going to write it this way. Instead of the href attribute, what I'm going to use is the src attribute like we do in images, and I'm going to type in main.js. And the other confusing part is that rather than this being a self-closing tag, we have to close it explicitly. Now, I'm going to give you some intuition for at least why we have to put this in the body tag instead of in the head tag. What we're going to be doing with this script is we're actually going to be manipulating these elements in the page. And I'll explain how we do that in a moment. But if we, for example, put it in the head, and we could, these elements wouldn't exist yet. Your web page sort of goes from top to bottom and reads it from top to bottom. So if you had a script tag up here, these elements wouldn't exist down here, and we couldn't do things with them. Once we get to here, we can guarantee that all the elements are available and we actually start doing stuff with them. But that'll come in a moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to I've got everything saved. I'm going to go to my web page. I'm going to refresh it, and we'll get this box at the top here that says I am a web developer, which is exactly what I wrote in my code. So if you're seeing this in front of you, everything's working. You've plugged everything in correctly. Now, this is a very, very frustrating way of displaying information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this line of code, and I'm never going to write alert ever again, because as web developers, we don't do that. It's just very frustrating for users, but it's a very easy way for us to tell that the script is working. So now when I refresh the page, I don't see anything. But what if one thing that's useful to do in code is to actually convey information to the user, to the programmer. So we want to do some bits and pieces in our code and then take a look and inspect it somewhere. And if you're used to coding or programming before, you might think of something like a console or somewhere to print data. We can do exactly the same thing in JavaScript. So there is something that allows us to communicate information to us as developers, but not to our users, and that's a really useful feature. So what I've just opened is the console in my browser, and it depends on which browser you're using as to how you open it, and that's pretty important. So for example, on Mac on Chrome, I've just hit Command-Alt-I, and it's opened up this thing down here, and I've clicked on console. On different browsers, it might be different. So if you're having trouble opening it, recommend just quickly Googling open console on browser, and you'll get some instructions. Or you can ask a demonstrator here if you're having trouble, but you want to see a screen like this in front of you, and all modern browsers have it. So this console is pretty neat. If you see an error like this, don't worry about it. This has something to do with this YouTube embed. That's something we can't control. But first of all, this console lets me type in JavaScript code, arbitrary stuff, and see the result of it. So JavaScript can handle numbers, and it says 5 is a 5. I can do arbitrary mathematical expressions as well. So I can say 5 plus 5 is 10, or do something a little more complicated. So this little star is a multiplication, and the slash is a divide. And I can do all sorts of nonsense like that, and I get the results, which is pretty neat. As well as numbers, JavaScript can handle text, and we wrap it in quotes. So I can say this is some text, and before me I'm given this text doohickey. And I can also, we'll go over this in more detail later, but I can also combine strings together. So I can add, if I use this plus, which you normally think of adding two numbers together, I can add two strings together. So the string text plus the string text is the string text text. And this will become useful later, and it's a pretty neat feature. So you'll notice that what we passed to this alert function was some things wrapped in quotes. I've just used the word function. I'll explain that in a little more detail later. But you see that's how we create text. Anyway, I'm going to get rid of that again. But instead of using alert, I'll change this to a console.log. Now what this says, instead of bringing that window up and showing it to our face, take this text and display it in this console. So if I refresh the page now, I'll see I'm a web developer floating down here. And that's a really good result. And to give you a little more intuition about this idea of a series of instructions, I can have I'm a web developer twice, and maybe, maybe write something different. So I can have a different console.log, and I can say this is my second message. And if I run this, now I see both of those messages displayed in the console, one after the other, just like I had them one after the other in here. Okay, so now's a good time to take a bit of a breather. Try and make sure you get everything working. So create this main.js file and use that alert snippet. And then you can use that script element to add that script to your page and make sure that you can see everything, see that pop-up up here. Can you also change the text that is displayed? So I had that I'm a web developer phrase, you could change it to something else, and then try and opening up the developer console and typing out some expressions like I just did, those mathematical expressions, and then later finally get rid of that alert statement because it's a very bad thing to do and replace it with console.log and make sure that text is printed to the console.